And welcome back to part 42 of Death End Request, where today it's floor 4, we're making progress, we've only got 2 floors left. And for some reason it plays Inferno on this fight in particular. But as I mentioned it before, but I do appreciate the fact that for the sake of variety, they start mixing up the entire soundtrack as you work your way through the pain area to stop it becoming so redundant and repetitive, even though it is still very repetitive regardless. But as the videos keep on getting longer, my subjects to talk about starts to shrink, so this is going to start to get harder and harder, particularly tomorrow's part, because that one's over 50 minutes long and I'm not sure how I'm going to be able to keep talking throughout all of that. But I'm going to kind of continue off a thread of discussion that I had last part, talking about my previous projects, because there was 2 projects that I deliberately avoided talking about because I wanted to talk about them afterwards, but then I was at the end of the video and I was like, oh whoops, never mind. And they are the 2 ones that never got finished. One of them, if you've been on this channel long enough, you might remember, but you can't find evidence of it on this channel anymore, because it was never going to get anywhere, unfortunately, for reasons I'll discuss. Whilst the other one just kinda stalled, and it became a bit of a permanent stalling because it was just something that I couldn't consistently keep up with and didn't have the time for, and have just yet to have the energy to go back to. Those being my Let's Play of Terraria and my blind-ish live stream of Final Fantasy X. Terraria, the biggest thing that shot me in the foot with Terraria is I drastically underestimated how recording it would be. Like, actually recording the game, playing it through and exploring everything, I enjoyed it, it was perfectly fine, but commentary as well. Terraria is a difficult game to talk about. Like, I mean really difficult to find things to constantly talk about, especially in the earlier parts where you're still trying to get your bearings and trying to get ores and trying to get a move on in certain areas. It was so impossibly difficult to talk about that I was straight up scrapping recording takes regularly. And it was just reaching one of those points where I was like, oh, this is way too much, I can't do this. Which is a shame, because I adore Terraria. Of all the sandbox-esque free to do what you want, build what you want and fight what you want-esque games, Terraria's always been my favourite. I've always adored it, and I wish I could have done it a bit more justice, but wow, it was just like holy shit. And the thing is, the main thing that ended up pushing me towards doing it in the first place was that I was frustrated, ironically, of how many other YouTubers who had started Terraria that stopped before they finished, for whatever reason. But now I kind of get why. But even the YouTubers who dedicate their lives to Terraria Let's Plays and whatnot, so like challenge runs and whatnot, they will suddenly vanish for like 6 to 8 months sometimes, even halfway through a project. And I now completely get why. It is such a difficult game to do commentary for. And it's why the only ones that are vaguely consistent are the ones that do written commentary. So it's like text commentary at the bottom of the screen, and so just let the game play itself, because then you don't need to have text on the screen all the time, so it would have been easier. And if there was ever a point where for whatever reason I go back to Terraria and try it again, I might just do that approach. I say that knowing full well that I'm not sure how I feel about doing that approach, and it could be more effort and more hassle than it's worth, but we'll see. But I don't want to completely give up on Terraria as an idea. I just needed to give it up at that point because I knew it was an impossible mission. And what didn't help is that when I was halfway through the project, the other thing that kind of ended up pushing me over and scrapping it was just not going through a good place of mind. I mentioned it in an update video during the time, but like, I had a member of my family pass away, and I got dumped by my partner at the time on the exact same day, and it was just like, wow, fuck, fuck me. And so I was just like, yeah, you know what? This project, I'm not enjoying doing the commentary for it as much as I love playing for it. Pushing myself to go through it when I'm not in the best headspace because of that personal reasons, it's just not, it's not wise, kind of thing. And in Final Fantasy X, I do enjoy Final Fantasy X. When I was playing through it, there was a point where for a couple of the streams I wasn't really enjoying it that much, but I do enjoy it for what it is, and I do have every intention of one day returning to it. The problem is that it's just been delayed indefinitely. Like, it's one day I will go back to it, I just don't know when that one day will be. And I don't think anyone will, because it's just when I get the spare time for live streaming, I don't really want to live stream. I'm usually wanting to do other stuff. Like, I'm glad I did the 2 live streams during October that I did, because I had a lot of fun with them and it felt nice to return to that formula. And I do want to do more live streams in the future, like when the right space of time comes. Like I'm going to struggle for time to do them coming up to Christmas because I do work, and so work is going to get busier for this holiday season because it always does. And so yeah, it's kind of why I'm also trying to get this project finished sooner, because I know I'm going to run out of time to finish the project otherwise. But it's just like, I do want to try and do more live streaming, and if I can get into a rhythm of it, then yeah, I'll return the Final Fantasy X and try and get it done properly. Even though I haven't played it in like forever. So I have no idea where I was last I played it. I think I'd have to go back through my footage to sort of act as a recap to work out whereabouts I am, because there's no way I'm going to know otherwise. But yeah, I think I did like 10 sessions of it in the end, and all of it I did before I got my my better mic that I've been using since like Sonic Mania, I think. I remember getting decked by Seymour. I remember that because I was fucking hilarious at the time. Well, I was like my first encounter as Seymour, and he gets to the 3rd phase, and he just happened to target the person who was supposed to be next, and beat and killed them. So then the next so then he got another turn, and so it just became a bit of a like snowball effect, and we all decked immediately, and I was like, what the fuck? I remember being very flabbergasted by it, because I thought it was the way it kind of started working out. I was like, oh, this is probably a scripted lost end, but no, I just got wrecked, and that was just how it was. That was just how the cards had to be. But I'll move on, because I've said all I really need to say on that bit. I just wanted to add that bit last part, but we ran out of time. The next thing I wanted to talk about, and this one I haven't made any notes for, I just kind of wanted to talk about it since I was going back through them recently, and that's a few games that I thoroughly enjoyed that I see a lot of people hate on, and a few games that I don't think are much that a lot of people seem to rave about. Yes, it's the overrated and overhated section of the of the video, yay! But it is something I want to talk about, because there are two very big examples that I have always felt are misplaced in terms of how overhated they are. Like overrated, I'm always prepared to be argued on, but overhated, some of them I do sit back on and go, well, why? And the two I want to talk about, no, I'll start with the easier one, the one that I think will be a little bit easier to defend and argue my point, and that's any of the Castlevania reboot. Yeah, if you're sitting there and going, oh fucking hell, Lord of Shadows, Mirror of Fate, Lord of Shadows 2, they were terrible, they were the worst games ever, then you're in a annoyingly, stupidly large majority, and I wish I was kidding. Almost every single Castlevania based thread, every single Castlevania based video, every single Castlevania anything has at least a dozen people in the comments saying how at least it's not Lord of Shadows, and how Lord of Shadows is the worst thing ever and was a complete insult to the fan base because it's a bunch of, it's just really miserable, depressing Castlevania that adds nothing to anything and shouldn't have ever existed, and Mercury's team should be ashamed of themselves, and it was one of Konami's black marks. I'm like, shut the fuck up, really? The game's amazing. Like Lord of Shadows, all of the games absolutely have problems. I'm not going to turn around and say that they're perfect by any stretch. They all absolutely have a load of problems. But to say that they're bad games and to say they're the worst things from Castlevania are extremely stupid, in my opinion. Which might be a bit forceful, but I mean that. Like, so I've gone through all three of them rather recently in a bit of a break from my marathon, since I've been doing a marathon through the whole mainline Castlevania. And after Symphony of the Night, I was like, no, I need to mix it up from the 2D stuff for a while before I got into Circle in the Moon and whatnot. And I just went through the Lord of Shadows trilogy on the Xbox One through the backwards compatibility. And I had a blast. Lord of Shadows 1, the amount of like really clever, well thought out puzzles, the amount of variety in different enemies with different difficulties, different strategies to work them out, the fact that after Chapter 1, well, and Chapter 2, because Chapter 2 is pretty chunky, they just litter these really original, clever bosses at you all the time that cause you to think outside the box and work out these different formulas, and some of the fights go on for a really long time, but they constantly remain entertaining, and they constantly test what you can do. And then the quick time events that don't feel as brutal as a lot of other games as quick time events were, even though they can catch you off guard in your first playthrough. And some of the skills you can get, like Gabriel has a pretty developed moveset with like button combinations and delay combos and holding down the button to do different things, and then skills tied to specific equipment. and then some skills tied to magic, so you can tie your light magic into specific skills or tie your dark magic into specific other skills to cause different effects, like, and the environments being pretty varied. Like, I was like, wow, Lord of Shadows 1 holds up really well. Why do people hate it so much? Is it, and like, at first I felt like I was going to say it's probably because it is just a reboot and people are against difference, but I think that would be rather arrogant for me to say. So I'm going to try and steer away from that and try and argue other reasons why people might have tried to knock it down a peg. And the first one, to be honest, is that chapter 1, after the intro, like the tutorial shows you how the game's going to work and whatnot, which is a fine tutorial level, I think, of how it works. The first proper level you get is a swamp.
Ready for battle. I'll tear you apart.
I don't think the very first level you do should have been a swamp. I think it should have been a forest, maybe. But a swamp, no, it kind of bogs down the mood, pun the pun, a little bit, like right off the bat, and makes you go, and then the very first boss, the Ice Titan, is a giant gimmick. All three of the Titan fights are kind of gimmicky, and like the only one I really enjoy is the third one because it's a straight up level. Like there's no way, and there's no way to just kind of climb it. It's a straight up level and navigating the fucking thing. But let's say like the whole first chapter, like minus the tutorial at the start, was a bit shaky, and I can understand if people kind of went, nope, that's not for me, and turned it down from there. But chapter 2 had a lot of really fun levels, and was the one that started to kind of say, okay, we are going to have some puzzle elements with this, we're going to experiment a bit more. And then here's some fairies, so you have some alternate ways of combat, because at the time you only have knives. Oh, and here's the crystal, so you have your screen nuke, where you can only be used in very specific situations, and it takes forever to recharge, so you gotta only use it when you really need to. To which I only saved it for like, I think I only used it twice in my playthrough, and one of them was in the DLC. And it's like, and then you have like the two bosses at the end, and the first one is another Titan, which I was a bit like, oh, here we go, two Titans back to back. But then after that's the Black Knight, and the Black Knight, I love that fight. It's such a fun, frantic fight with multiple phases and different attacks that gets you like proper wrapped up, because it's the first traditional boss of the game. The first two are giant gimmicks. This is the first one where it's an actual brawl down, like an actual smackdown. You got to fight and do what you can, and it's after a rather intense moment of maybe Gabriel killing someone, but you're not sure if they have or not, if he has or not, but like you can kind of work out maybe something dodgy has happened here. And you go into chapter 3 and you've got that one pretty lengthy but witty level of having to no, chapter 3 is where you get the fairies, sorry, where you get like, you have to work with the fairies to try and open this specific door, so you have to go and navigate this entire like non-linear level that has loads of different paths and ways around it, and so many little secrets to find. And then afterwards you get the first Lord of Shadow, which is a great fight, which is a really well built up fight because it's the whole point of the game. And then after that you're suddenly on your way, working your way towards Castlevania, and you're working up to find the vampire's castle and do that, and it's just the way it escalates and starts building up throughout the whole thing. And then after you're done with the vampires and you get fucking wings, which is badass, and then you start working towards the necromancers. And then the last proper level of the game, the Necromancer's Abyss, which is this giant level that only has two types of enemies. One of them that can do 70% of your life in a single swing, but they pretty much die in one hit, those being the Reapers. And then the Necromancers that can summon the Reapers at will, made it a really intense and sudden level. But then the puzzles in it were really amazing. Like there was a puzzle where you had to, using this giant sundial, alter the positioning of the sun and the moon so that they eclipse through a circular gap in the mountain in front of you.
I'm feeling better.
And then when you did that, it changed the layout of the land around you so you could navigate forward. Just for the next one to be a one where there's a bunch of dials and pressing them causes a like spark to move around the arena, and you have to press them in a certain order so then in a pattern they will navigate the entire board to get to the other side. Like these really enjoyable, cleverly made puzzles were put together, plus also with the combat system and how many different enemies and bosses there were. And then the DLC, Revere and Resurrection. Revere just being nothing but puzzles, the DLC. Well, plus a section where you play as Laura for a bit, which admittedly I felt was a bit weak, but for the sake of mixing it up for a DLC, I took it for what it was. But the puzzles were really clever, like the one where you have to essentially set up a chess game to have the pieces in very specific positions, but all the hints, you have to notice that the board is, on each hint, the board is spun a different direction. So just because it says that a black knight needs to be in one place, but then the next piece says the same black knight needs to be in another place, you have to work out that actually no, it is the same place, but one of them's flipped. And so you have to piece it together to make it work. Or the trap wall, where it's like a giant blade wall, and you have to work out how to navigate it, but you've got Laura altering the electricity of it that makes the blades either stop moving or move faster. And if you can get them to move faster, it makes certain other ones start moving, so you can try and navigate past them. But if you move faster, then of course they're coming at you faster as well when you're in their line of sight.
Another one down.
And then like the end bit where they had 3 dedicated sections to each of the Lord of Shadows, so you actually got a bit of trivia on what they were like when they were human before they became the Lords of Shadows, when they were the 3 founders of the Order. You got to see what happened to Corneal, what happened to Camilla, and what happened to Zobek, and then you had these really like interesting situations that you had. But the one with Laura of Camilla was a bit because you had to drain blood from enemies and then use that blood to give up health to restore this altar. But Laura's combat kind of wasn't suited well enough for what it was asking, and if I ever go back through it on the hardest difficulty, I'm not particularly looking forward to it, but we'll see. But in the second DLC, Resurrection, it's only 2 levels, and it's just 2 halves of one insanely brutal boss fight. Like, it's straight up super boss. So they split it into 2 levels, and the first one you spend half the level not letting the super boss see you, because he's got a power tied to his soul that makes him completely immortal. So trying to fight him would be a suicide mission. You have to wait for him to temporarily give up that power to try and open this seal that's stopping him from getting into the real world. And then you fight him, but then halfway through the fight, the seal breaks, so you have to hide again. And so in the second level, you're hiding again as he works his way to the next seal. And then when he gets to the seal that would allow him, like the final seal, allow him into the human world, that's where you gotta beat him. And the fight is insane! It is so stupidly tough because he's so goddamn quick. He hits like a goddamn truck and gives you nothing in return. Like, it's an absolute ultimate final test, and I loved that. It was such a well done thing. Yeah, it took me like 50 minutes to beat him, but I actually managed to do it, and it was great fun. And you finally got to the explanation of how Gabriel became so powerful as he was, because to only even enter the domain that this Forgotten One was in, he had to become a vampire. So that was the first stage of how he became Dracula, and then he stole the immortal power from the Forgotten One right in front of him, which explains how he became the most powerful vampire. Like, boom, boom, there you go. And I was like, fuck yeah, this is amazing. And yet everyone hates on it, and I don't get it. I've never got it. I'm like, what? This Lord of Shadows is a great game. It's not the best Castlevania, absolutely not, but it's an amazing game in its own right, and it's far better than a lot of other Castlevanias. And so the fact that people say it's the worst one is fucking stupid, at least in my opinion. Mirror of Fate, it is, however, the one that is the weakest of the 2D Castlevanias, in my opinion. And yeah, that is even acknowledged in Castlevania 2 Simon's Quest. I just felt that the game was very limiting with what it was doing, but I did find the story very well handled and very interesting. Like, they have the big climax of the game, but there's still a whole other act to go, and you're like, huh? But then you realise that the whole other act is setting up this one big plot twist that you can kind of see coming as you play through the third act, but it's cleverly enough done that it was the right order to do that. Like, if Act 2 and Act 3 were flipped, like, there would be no gravity in the twist at all. But so the fact that they have it that way, it made it a really fitting twist, and you can understand how things became how they were, what became of Gabriel afterwards, what became of his son and his grandson Simon, even if it is a bit of a non-issue, because Simon's then not back in Lord of Shadows 2 because it's based in modern day. And then you have Lord of Shadows 2 on the end of it, which the only thing I've ever found disappointing about Lord of Shadows 2 is the final boss. And the fact they only got to have one DLC, despite the fact there's a lot of evidence that they originally intended to do a lot more. There are these doors you can find about the place that are locked and you can just never open. There's 3 of them, and one of them you open in the only DLC the game got, and the other 2, well, the DLCs never came to be. For whatever reason, they just stopped happening. They were going to, but they just didn't happen. And I can imagine those doors would have been opened if the DLC had ever happened. because there was probably going to be a Victor DLC, because Victor got so little screen time in the main game before he got killed off. You literally chase after him, have a boss fight with him, he walks you over to a plaza, and then he gets killed to lure out a acolyte. And you're like, oh, bye Victor. Damn. What I thought was Victor was cool, I wanted them to do a little bit more of him, but that's what his DLC, if he had got one, would have been about, and it would have been fascinating to see play as him, because he would have had Gabriel's moveset from the first game just expanded to Lord of Shadows 2's set. And now they changed Gabriel's moveset from one really elaborate one that had some few twists and changes to slightly simplifying his main moveset, but giving him an extra 2 on top of it. Because replacing his light magic was a whole other weapon that acted the same as light magic, as in you drained health when you hit enemies with it, but it was a whole other weapon with its own moveset. It was the Void Sword. And then you got the Chaos Claws on the other end to replace your dark magic, which still hit like a truck like when you used dark magic, but were, like I said, another weapon. They were gauntlets. And so you had 3 whole movesets that you could swap between mid-combo and it would carry through. Which I always enjoyed that, because how they kind of standardized it. They could make it so if you started a combo with one and swapped to the other weapon, like you could do 1-2 with the whip but then do 3 with the gauntlet, or like 1-2-3 and then 4 the sword, or sort of thing. Like you could mix it up, and it made it really fun to mess around with because of it. Plus the vampiric abilities and how hard they go in on it just made it really fun. So the only thing that let it down for me was the final boss, because they spent the whole game building up this great showdown between Dracula and Satan, which as a premise alone is hype as fuck. Dracula versus the goddamn devil. Like, what the hell, wow. But all he does in the final boss is possess your son. You fight him and then Dracula kills him in a cutscene, and I was just a bit like, that was wasted potential. Like, the fight against Satan when he's possessing Alucard is an amazing fight, and like, it really comes into its own on the harder difficulties. But at the same time, I was a bit like, oh, come on. But the rest of the game, exploring the actual castle or exploring the city in modern day, because you can alternate between the two as you go, both of which are really fun to explore. The only area that was a bit is City of the Damned, but even then, City of the Damned, it's only 100%ing it that I didn't really enjoy. Actually just going through it the first time, it's great fun. The entire game is amazing. It once again had a plethora of really inventive creative bosses. Not as many as Lord of Shadows 1, I think, but there were a lot of bosses that were really clever of how they handled it. And some of them were really frantic as well. Like, you had to really be on your toes to keep up with them. And it made it so much more fun. Like, it felt like a natural evolution of the games, and it's a shame for whatever reason that they just got stopped. That's the one DLC we did get, Revelations, where we actually got to play as Alucard. That was amazing. The only thing that let it down was that it was so short. It was only like an hour and a half long at most. But then it was a DLC that came out only like a month afterwards, so I guess I wasn't really expecting it even at the time for it to be that big. But I was expecting there to be more DLC to come, because it was kind of, you could tell it was they were planning to, but it just never got to happen. So I've just never got, because of it, why the Lord of Shadows games get as hated as they were. Like, there was a point in time where I actually wanted to do a dedicated video discussing all 3, like really in depth, and go on for like an hour talking about all of them, but I don't think it would be worth it, because I feel like I wouldn't be able to change anyone's minds anyway. I just have never understood the hate thrown at Lord of Shadows. As a series, they're not bad games, even remotely. They've got problems for sure, but they are not bad games, and they're far better than a lot of actual mainline Castlevanias. Like, do I have to mention 64, Judgment?
All good.
And as much as I enjoy Lament of Innocence and Curse of Darkness, are you really going to tell me they're better games than Lord of Shadows? Because I'm sorry, but they're not. And just age is only so much to add to it, but the game's just, especially Curse of Darkness, just has so many giant empty rooms just for the sake of making everything feel bigger. Yeah, the music is amazing, but the music alone is not enough to fucking sell me on a game. I'm sorry. it's not how this works. But I'll move on, because I've wound up one community to the next. Now, the other game that I think is really overhated is Final Fantasy 13-2. 13-1, I understand the arguments. The game does struggle a lot. The fact that you have to get 9 chapters into the game before it picks up is nothing I could ever reasonably encourage towards anyone. How could you reasonably say, oh, this 40 to 60 hour game, you have to do 2/3 of it before it gets good? No, you can't. It's not. It's stupid. No one would turn around and say, "Oh, I can do that," despite the fact that then people would go on to play Kingdom Hearts 3, despite the fact that it's the exact same problem. But it's just, I get it. I get why that game gets a lot of hate on it, and I completely understand it. I don't think it's that bad, but I do understand that expecting someone to go that far before they touch it. Yeah, I get it. 13.2 though, I can't help but feel like a lot of people hate on it just because it's a sequel to the game they didn't like. And as much as I can kind of understand that, there are a lot of games I can think of that kind of struggled on their first outing, but then nailed it on their second. Evil Within is a good example. The first Evil Within, as much as I enjoy it, is very stiff and rigid and full of problems, yet the sequel knocked it out the park. It was amazing.
Alright, let's go.
But just because the first game's bad doesn't mean that the sequel shouldn't be given a fair shot sometimes, and 13.2 is a perfect example of that. A lot of the hate thrown at it, I can't help but feel like it's just there because people didn't like 13.1 and so assumed it'd be the same again, when in reality 13.2 is actually, in my opinion, one of the best Final Fantasies in the series. In fact, I'd go as far to say it's in my top 3.
Who should I aim for?
13.2, its story, its world, the way that you can mess around with time and it actually have genuine consequences, the variety of different like endings and things and predicaments you could get. Like, you could get yourself trapped in a chicken and egg paradox and the game would acknowledge it. Like, there are so many cleverly written things, plus a fascinating villain voiced by Liam O'Brien with Caius, who genuinely was fascinating because he wasn't really a villain at all. He just wanted you to stop fucking around with time because it was killing people and making others cease to exist in your mindless dream to try and get lightning back. And so it just made everything so fascinating, and all the optional areas, and there were some puzzles as well. Like, it's like they had this ongoing thing with like this clock puzzle where like standing on certain things would move the clock piece so many places, and you had to make it so it would touch every single number on the dial at least once before finishing. The problem is that it was very fucking tough. Some of them were brutal, and so it kind of got a little bit overbearing sometimes, because the one thing stopping you from getting this one extra plot detail that you might have wanted to get was this stupidly tough puzzle that you just kind of smash your head into and try everything to try and get, and it just nothing was happening. You're like, And the fact that they lowered down the cast to 2 playable characters, but then like devoted to making the most of those 2 characters, deserve praise. Because I did feel like, even though they only had 6 in 13.1, not all the characters were interesting. Lightning was vaguely interesting, but only later on when she starts developing. Snow, I only like Snow because of who his fiance was, because I like Sarah more. Sarah, I think, is a really well polished and well done character, and more so in 13.2, which actually, you know, the game's dedicated to her, but I really enjoy Sarah as a character. But then after that, like, Vanille just annoyed me for the entire adventure. Fang just annoyed me for most of the adventure. Not all of it, but most of it. Saz is cool, but if he wasn't in it, I wouldn't be losing sleep. So what's left? Hope. Like, the most frustratingly annoying character I've ever had the mispleasure of playing as in a video game. Like, the cast was, like, it was too weak as a whole, the cast. And so the fact that they shrunk it down to Sarah and Noel in the sequel, and both of them were very strong characters, really helped make the difference. And so I really appreciate 13.2. And the DLCs were fun. They had a Colosseum where you got to fight Gilgamesh, and Gilgamesh would even take the piss out of it and be really self-aware and say, I'm starting to think you would never buy this part of the game. Like, they had so much stupid fun with it. And it's just like, I wish 13.2 got more appreciation than it got, because it was a good game. It absolutely was a really solid game.
Alright, leave it to me.
And I say this because I know it was also trapped between Lightning Returns, and Lightning Returns I personally really don't enjoy. I felt Lightning Returns is the only one of the 13 trilogy that really deserved a lot of the hate it got, because I was just straight up like, no, this is really not good. I really don't enjoy what this is trying to do. I know some people like it, but I was just like, no. The only other thing I can really say to defend about Final Fantasy 13 is that of any of the 13 games, watch the speedrun of it. Speedrunners actually are kind of very different in their opinions. They really enjoy 13 because of how many ways you can twist and manipulate things to really work it in your favour to get through the game stupidly quick. But 13.2, although it's very open in other ways, there's a lot of open things you need to do before you can get access to the end. so it takes a bit longer. And then Lightning Returns, despite the fact the whole point of it is to be really quick, it's the most anti-speedrunner game ever, and so so a lot of speedrunners actually really don't like it. So it's like their opinion worsens as the series goes on, whilst me, I love the middle one and I'm kind of naysay with the two outside it. But that's kind of all I've got to say, is it's just give Castlevania Lord of Shadows a try and give 13-2 a try. Both of them I think will surprise you if you give them a good shot, because they are definitely worth your time and fun games in their own way. But I guess I should go on to the other side of the fence, since I said I would, and we've still got 10 minutes I've got to try and kill here in this video. Talk about games that I think are overrated.
Who should I aim for?
And I'm gonna be careful about how I handle this. If you know me, you know that I prefer gameplay over story. I love a good story, but if you decide to sacrifice the gameplay for the story, I don't care for your story. And so saying this, I do feel, and I've made a video about it, ranting about it, that the reboot God of War is drastically overrated. Because you're the god of goddamn war, why the hell are you now trying to make grounded, realistic gameplay? You're the god of fucking war. But it's supposed to be so you wouldn't take the story as seriously if the game was really bouncy and over the top, to which I say fuck off Devil May Cry. Devil May Cry has some of the wackiest, most woohoo bullshit gameplay ever, and yet when it wants to be serious in the story, it absolutely fucking nails it every single time. DMC3's ending, most of DMC5 are perfect examples. When the game wants to be serious in its story, it can absolutely work despite the wacky gameplay. It doesn't destroy anything in the story at all. All they do is say it's a fucking video game with a great story. That's all they do. Whilst the reboot God of War was all like, no, the gameplay needs to be more grounded and realistic, despite the fact you're the God of War. And it's because the story is more grounded. Because it's not a game script, it's a movie script, which is the most retarded sentence I've ever heard. But I'll let that slide because I don't want to rant too much.
All good.
But then it's like, a lot of people were really on board with it. And it's like, yeah, you're right, it's not a game script. And I was like, Metal Gear Solid 1. Are you telling me that video games just can't have Hollywood level scripts? Video games have been having Hollywood level and beyond Hollywood level scripts, because let's be honest, most Hollywood scripts are really bad.
Who should I aim for?
One of the most poor forms of film is Hollywood nowadays. They are not what they are. They just chase trends and hope for the best. But like, this whole idea of games have to be super serious if they're gonna have a good story is just idiotic. Like, who decided that we have to take away fun for our serious story? No, you can absolutely have fun with a serious story. You can absolutely make gameplay ridiculous as all hell and still break people's hearts. Yakuza 0. That game is stupidly fun, yet the story is so emotionally intense at points that it really, it drove me to tears at one point. In one particular moment, really late on in the adventure, it straight up made me cry. Despite the fact the game is the most wacky woohoo nonsense I've played since Devil May Cry. And I've always just had that issue with the reboot God of War because of it. Cause I was just a bit like, well, no, it's not a necessary thing, and I don't want the industry as a whole to take so many notes from it as it probably is going to, because it's unnecessary. It's the same reason why I played through Last of Us 1 and then never touched it again. Because yeah, the story was pretty good. Oh, here's the boss, by the way. But the gameplay did the whole super realistic over anything else, and it suffered for it. It completely demolished any desire for me to replay it. Making it slightly difficult to play for the sake of encouraging survival is one thing, but making it stupidly over the top realistic, making every gun shake like a moron, and make every single thing you try and do as difficult as humanly possible and as slow as possible for the sake of realism, just bored me. It didn't get me into the atmosphere, it just bored the shit out of me. I didn't want to play it. So I thought that Last of Us was very overrated as well, and it's why I'm not even going to bother picking up the sequel. Which I know kind of goes against my previous argument of if you don't enjoy the first one, it doesn't mean completely ignore the second. But I'm not about to start hating on the sequel. That's the difference. If people end up enjoying the sequel, I'll say, okay, cool, I'm just not fussed about it. I'm not going to turn around and say it's shit, because I haven't played it, so I don't have an opinion on it. I'm just not interested. But Last of Us 1, it was just, no, I was like, I like the characters, I like the story, and I like what they're trying to do. I just didn't like any of the gameplay, and to me, that's the most important thing. making the gameplay super realistic for some fake sense of believability is just a waste of time, because it just bores me. And I can imagine it bores a lot of people, but they get shut up by the die-hard fanboys who refuse to listen to anything else. And I can say that from fucking experience. I think a lot of people can. I see it all the goddamn time on Facebook, on Twitter, on Reddit, on Tumblr, on any social media site at all. I see it all the time. The moment someone touches the fragile ego of a die-hard fanboy, they will go full throttle on anything and everything to do with it, regardless of how genuine and constructive the feedback may be. If anyone dares say anything bad, it's like, no, you're just a hater. And it's like, well, no, there's fair feedback. There's a reason why they're adding a jump to the sequels, because people were criticizing that it was trying too hard to be realistic when it should have at least allowed some things. So there's going to be a dedicated jump button in the sequel. Because even Neil Druckmann understands that feedback is a necessary thing to get far in the industry, regardless of how far in the industry you already are. Feedback is always something that is going to help. And just because the diehards are like, no, leave it alone, it's perfect. It's like, well, no, nothing's perfect, first of all. So allow change. The things you love the most are the things you should be most open to criticizing, because it's the only way you're going to see it continue to grow.
Let's go.
It's the reason why, as much as I love the Persona series, I will criticize Persona when asked to, because there are many things with the Persona series as a whole that have problems. Dating all the way back to the original to nowadays, there are problems series-wide. It's why I will mention what games in Final Fantasy are a bit rough and which ones are great, despite loving the series, because I just want to see the series grow. That's all I want to see. As a fan, I want to see it grow, and so if that means highlighting where it's struggling, I will do so every time without failure. That doesn't make me a hater. That doesn't make anyone a hater. That makes them a fan, as far as I'm concerned. The people who aren't fans are the ones that blindly defend it and then wonder why it progressively gets worse and worse. And why people stop playing it despite the fact they keep on telling themselves it's the best thing ever.
Alright, keep going.
But then it's the same reason as well, and this isn't me trying to turn on Neil Druckmann, because I think the dude's really swell and he is doing what he's doing very well in his own way, but I didn't like Uncharted 4 either. I feel Uncharted 4 is the weakest Uncharted, because it has an amazing story, but what they did to the gameplay made it far less enjoyable. Making it far stiffer but throwing a grappling hook in front of my face was only going to do so much. And it really started to show through when I went through it on the hardest difficulty, because I did all the Uncharted on the hardest difficulty, ignoring Brutal, since this was before Brutal was a thing with the Uncharted collection. But Uncharted 4's crushing is a whole different beast. The first three games crushing, in terms of it's not fun. It's extremely bullshit and poorly handled, because it's the same sort of AI and systems as the first three games, but now you've got the really shit, overly stiff, because of realism, quote unquote, gameplay, instead of it just being fucking fun. Which is what Uncharted in particular was all about, and what Amy Hennig understood perfectly. Uncharted could have serious stories. I mean, Uncharted 2 and Uncharted 3, when it was functioning, did have pretty weighty stories in places. But it was still a really fun game when you got into it. You were still bouncing around shooting people like a jackass without a care in the world. And it just had like such a blast with itself because of it. And yet the fourth game suddenly tried to tone all that back for the sake of realism, and it hurt it more than helped it. Doesn't matter how good the story was, it wasn't a fun game to go back to, and I stopped playing it. Like, if I ever return to the Uncharted series, yeah, I'll do 3, but don't expect me to do 4 anytime soon, because I enjoy 3 more than 4. And that's pretty much all the ones I can think of, because all the rest that I kind of think is overrated. I don't think anything negatively on them. I just wish more attention was drawn to others, like Death Stranding. Like, Death Stranding is a perfectly fine game in its own front. I just feel like too much praise was thrown at it because of the name of the creator alone. I think too many people are like, oh, it's Hideo Kojima, so it has to be the best thing ever. Instead of acknowledging that the game, although the gameplay is doing what it's doing, the game's boring. I found the game very boring to me personally. The story was fascinating and I loved seeing where it was going, but similar to a lot of other games I've already spoken about, I couldn't justify that, because the gameplay is just Fetch Quest the video game for the entire duration, and it gets redundant, especially when the overworld's as big as it is. And I wish Kojima with his next project would go back to linear instead of open world, because he mastered it so well. But that being said, I've gone on enough and we're at the end of the video, so next time on Death End Request we'll finish the pain area. But until then, you guys take care now.